Good afternoon. And this is a very interesting and unique and critical time, I think, in our nation's history. The first thing I want to thank you, number one, for agreeing to have this chat today. But number two, for what you have done by offering yourself for public service and what you continue to do, perhaps on a daily basis. And during this particular crisis, and while our nation has gone through many crisis situations, I guess the first thing is how do you find it being at home now? We are all at home with our children and wives, our wife, and it's just a very interesting experience. So just from an initial standpoint, how are your days going?
As well as really anyone could expect or hope for. I'm very fortunate. My family is healthy. We have a relatively pleasant environment. Like you, though, I wake up and I think about the time our country is going through and what I can do to help. And the needs are just so vast that unfortunately, I don't think like a minute goes by when I don't think about what families are going through around the country. And so I feel very engaged trying to help, and then frustrated that, like everyone else, I'm trapped in my home. So it's like, what does helping look like? So having this kind of conversation certainly is a great opportunity. And it's the kind of thing that we can hopefully use this time for. And I hope this conversation ends up, I'm sure I'll learn a lot from it, but I hope this conversation ends up being helpful to others.
Well, certainly, that is certainly my hope as well. And, most importantly, when one does what you have done, which is make a decision, of course, it may start in some cases through some level of reaching out to our creator. It may start with reaching out to, obviously, with our families. How did you come to a decision as to embarking upon running for the highest office in our land?
No, before the campaign, I spent a little less than 7 years running a nonprofit that I had started. And that nonprofit, Venture for America, helped train entrepreneurs and create jobs in parts of the country that could use a boost. And I became convinced that the work of not just my nonprofit, but of just the nonprofit sector generally was not going to be sufficient to meet the growing needs of our time. And so it was a very difficult realization because, you're doing work and you think, hey, I'm doing work I'm proud of and helping people. But then when you realize, the needs are so much bigger, and I realized that you would need to have a complete rewrite of the way our economy works if you're going to genuinely try and meet the needs, and that the only way to do that would be to control the government. And this was in the wake of Donald Trump's victory in 2016, because I thought Trump's election was something of a cry for help. Honestly, it's like it was like a distress signal, and so after 2016, I started thinking, well, okay, if I genuinely believe that the only way I could solve these problems is to run for president, I guess that's what I should do. And so it was like a tough conversation, certainly with my wife and others, and frankly with friends, because when I first told them I was running for president, most found it to be almost unimaginable, almost unfathomable. I'm grateful to the friends who, even if they didn't believe that I was going to be successful, that they decided to support me anyway. So it was an evolution, but it was born of the fact that I'd spent the last 7 years running a nonprofit. And I realized that it wasn't going to solve the problems that I was motivated by.
So, in relationship to the campaign, if you had to identify the 4 or 5 or 6 things that you felt you were able to accomplish, what would you say that they were, and how would you rank them?
Number one, I believe that I introduced millions of Americans and excited millions of Americans around the idea of a universal basic income or freedom dividend that your father argued so powerfully for decades ago. And the fact that we're now going to be putting approximately $1,200 in the hands of tens of millions of Americans in the next couple of weeks. I feel like I hastened our ability to implement that particular approach because I'd spent the last 2 years arguing for putting money into people's hands. And so it was a more natural thing for people to do. So I'd say that's number one, the thing I'm proudest of, because I feel like that idea seemed far out to many, many people throughout my campaign. And then we're now doing it because we're in crisis mode. In my mind, we've been in crisis mode for quite some time, certainly for tens of millions of Americans that have been living in financial precariousness for years and years. To me, the crisis was with us the whole time. But I'm proud of the fact that I think I helped advance your father's ideas right before this crisis hit.
Wow. You know, that certainly was one of the things that that resonated because I do remember Dad talking about universal income and really guaranteed annual income. And so I do think that there was a percentage of Americans that thought, well, this idea is insane, but it really is, in a real sense, it's brilliant. And it's having the ability to realize where there is a void and to address it. One of the questions I wonder is, how do you sustain this the level of income, or is there a way to sustain? Do you see that? We know that during this crisis, perhaps there will be a number of iterations, but after the crisis, unfortunately, until we get to the point where the consciousness exists, I certainly believe that there's an abundance in the universe and in this nation, particularly, and in our world. But how do you sustain so that people do have an annual income?
The problem right now is that our current revenue system for the government does not capture the true gains of the economy. Where you have a $1 trillion company like Amazon literally paying zero in taxes, you have Netflix paying zero in taxes, you have like all these major companies, Starbucks paying zero in taxes. And so when you're looking around saying, how can we sustain this? It's very hard to sustain something like a guaranteed annual income for all Americans if your biggest companies are literally paying zero. And we have this economy that has concentrated the gains in the hands of really a relatively small number of individuals and firms. And if we can help distribute those gains more broadly throughout the economy, it would make it so that we could fund a guaranteed annual income pretty straightforwardly. Maybe for the first time in history, we have the resources, and it's what you just expressed, where this is the richest, most advanced economy in the history of the world. We're going through a very, very disastrous time right now. But before this crisis hit, our annual economy was generating $21 trillion a year in value. And so if you imagine putting, let's call it, for the sake of argument, $2 trillion into the hands of every Americans, how much of that value would just get pumped right back into the economy every single day? The vast majority of it. uh, it may even end up paying for itself in better health outcomes, education outcomes, uh, levels of business formation and entrepreneurship, lower rates of incarceration. So we can afford this if you just look at the top line numbers. The issue really is whether our society is in position to capture those gains, because right now it's not. Right now we have this personal and corporate tax system that the truly wealthy can just like essentially avoid, run rings around, ignore. And that's why we feel like we don't have the resources, but we 100% do by the numbers.
Well, in light of this, the crisis and the door being opened, do you believe that, I know your leadership and perhaps others and a team of people around the nation will continue to anytime in the near future, this happening?
Well, I think it will happen. I think that the fact that millions of Americans are going to get this stimulus into their hands, they're going to frankly like it. I just want to make sure that I got the question right, because you cut out for a little bit. Was that the question? Were you asking whether basic income is actually going to be implemented?
That is correct. Do you believe it will be?
Oh, yeah. So we're going to get this stimulus in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And tens of millions of Americans are going to get, let's call it $1,200 into their bank accounts. And they're going to like it. They're going to think, wow, this really helps me put groceries, on the table. This helps take a load off. This makes me feel better about my immediate future. It doesn't transform my personality. It doesn't transform my neighbor's personality. It doesn't somehow make me like less self-reliant or any of the other kind of nonsense that's out there. And they're going to say, well, if we did this and it was great, and yes, it was an emergency, why don't we keep doing this sort of thing ongoing? So this idea is here to stay. We're going to be, in my opinion, implementing more and more of these kinds of policies, not just in 2024, but I think it's still going to be debated right now in 2020. And I do not think that this $1,200 check that we're all going to get is a one-time thing, because unfortunately this crisis is likely to drag on well past April.
One of the last major campaigns that my father was working on in 1967, before his death, was called the Poor People's Campaign, where he wanted to bring together poor blacks, poor whites, poor Native Americans from all walks of life, to actually say to our national leaders that we want to ensure that the annual income, a basic annual income, is guaranteed. Of course, he did not live to see that come to fruition, and because he was killed. As a result, today in our nation, we have well over what the numbers are in terms of those who are poor, who are working. If you add those who are working or who were working prior to this crisis, it's in excess of 75, 80 million people. And yet our forecasters and indicators say that we had this great economy. So was that economy a false, were we as were Americans misled about what really exists? And in addition to that, how do we address that crisis of so many being living at the poverty level in a nation with, as you said, a $21 trillion working economy?
Now, the big problem we've had is that we've been measuring the wrong things, and we've been telling a story about how great the economy is when it has not been great for more and more Americans for decades. And some of the indicators that I would share on the trail were that we have record high levels of not just financial insecurity, but even deaths of despair, of drug overdoses, of stress and anxiety and mental health problems. All of our human indicators of well-being were heading downward, even while the economy kept growing. And so the problem is that we've been measuring our collective bottom line by the bottom line of a number of small companies, like a small number of very, very big companies, generally speaking. And we pretended that if those companies did well, then we were doing well. But it turns out those two things diverged years and decades ago. So if you look at the story we've been told, was it a false story? It was not a false story if you accept their definitions, but it was a false story if you took a human definition of the economy. Because for families around the country watching their communities' way of life disintegrate, how Pfizer stock does is immaterial. You know what I mean? Like if you took Pfizer stock as like the measuring stick, then you could say, well, like, you know, that's been doing well. So the challenge for us really is to try and get these two lines together and humanize the way we talk about the economy, the way we measure the economy, the way we even design and engineer the economy. And that's, to me, the direction that we should be pushing as hard as possible after this crisis finally clears. Because if we keep using the same measuring sticks, we're doomed. You know, like, and the fact is, all of the social ills that I was concerned about on the trail are going to surge to unprecedented levels because of this crisis. And we need to put resources to work directly into our people's hands to try and make this a human economy that actually works for people, families, communities around the country. That's my great hope from this crisis. This crisis is devastating. It's terrible on so many levels. My only hope is that it prompts us to think much, much bigger about how we can rewrite the rules of this economy from the top down and the ground up, so that they actually start working for us. That's my only silver lining in the midst of what is a devastating time for millions of us.
Have you been able to have any discussions with economists or other experts who bring additional credibility to, unfortunately, the crisis brings it right up in front of all of our eyes, and all of us are having to address or adjust to the crisis. But have you, prior to the crisis, had you had discussions with economists and others, and including members of Congress who were interested in what you articulated and wanting to work with you to implement?
I have spoken to a number of members of Congress who are increasingly interested in trying to come up with better measurements for the economy. I have talked to some economists, not as many as I'd like, because I hadn't been off the trail that long, and while we were on the trail, my schedule was pretty packed. But I have been talking to both economists and members of Congress, and there is a real openness and enthusiasm to many of these ideas, because many economists have sensed that the dashboard has been wrong for a while, that you should not have record high levels of deaths of despair if the economy was working the way it's supposed to.
So does that mean, I guess, of course, we all are now focused in a very unusual way. We're in our homes. We are redeveloping relationships that maybe were in a different way because we are all, in a sense, we're sheltered in, and maybe one day we'll be able to look at not the blessings of the virus, but the situation created a scenario where the hope is that people and communities will become close again, because we know that the discourse has been uncivil for quite some time. And obviously that civil discourse begins with leadership, and leadership at the top. And one of the ways that we begin to change that, in addition to what the situation has created, is, of course, by electing other people to office who represent a different kind of voice. My father and my mother were always about building coalitions in our nation and throughout our world. And we're about looking at what is in the interest of everyone, not one particular segment. So my question is, do you believe that out of this very, very unfortunate set of circumstances, that we as a nation will become a closer nation, a nation that wants to work together in a civil way, as opposed to what we saw prior to this crisis?
Well, I certainly hope so. That's my earnest ambition. But that sort of thing doesn't happen without people leading in the right direction and dedication, hard work. But certainly I hope so. And I hope that you and I and other like-minded people can help make that happen. Certainly there are some people who sense that there's a need. The need is greater than ever for us to come together and build a bigger, broader, inclusive coalition. I hope so. I hope so. I leave it at that. I mean, I think it's very interesting. One of the things I think that we've fallen victim to, frankly, over the last number of years is this market-based, like what goes up must come down. Well, if we're all trapped in our houses now, we'll all come together later. like that. There's like this sort of like part of the way we've all been indoctrinated at this point is to be kind of like positive and adaptable, I suppose, because it's almost required for market success. And so, like, it's a natural impulse to say, well, things are so bad now that it's going to give rise to some very, very good things later. And I certainly hope that's the case, but I think that it's going to take a lot of work. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. What do you think of the CARE Act provision?
I think it's great that they did something. I think putting money into people's hands is also very positive. I wish that it were bigger and broader. I wish that it went on for longer periods of time. I wish that a great proportion of the $2.2 trillion went to people and families and not industry. But I'm glad that they got together and did something. I do think it's going to prove to be insufficient, and that they're going to need to get back to the table and pass additional stimulus in a matter of days.
Wow. So how do you, in terms of your activities now, and I know we all are maybe stuck in our homes and should be, we all need to be sheltering, but how do you find your days in terms of what you're able to accomplish in a day, and in a traditional way? Obviously we were all moving around, and we can quantify, but how would you quantify what you're able to accomplish during this period of time?
Well, I'm working on a number of things that are all the more relevant given the circumstances we're in. So, number one, I started a nonprofit called Humanity Forward that has a coronavirus relief fund of, at this point, it's around 1.22 million or so, and we're giving it to people in need in real time. So we've given the vast majority of it away already, and the needs are so vast. So Humanity Forward is something I'm very proud of. We're just getting started. I'm launching a podcast called Yang Speaks next month, and we're starting to have those conversations. Would love to have you on. And then we could turn the tables, and then instead of you asking me questions, I'll ask you questions. I'm sure you have incredible things to share. I'm working on a project to help fight for consumer data rights, and it might even involve people getting compensated for their data rights. So it's another way to get money into people's hands. That's very exciting. So if you live in California, Nevada, you go to movehumanityforward.com, and we might be able to help get some money into your hands. I'm commentating for CNN, which you might have seen. So they still have me doing that from afar. And I'm working on a project right now to try and activate all Americans to show that we're bigger and better than this virus. It's going to be a campaign, and the campaign does have an element of the Asian American community trying to do everything we can to combat the virus, because the tough fact is that many Americans feel higher levels of antipathy towards Asians right now, because they feel like this virus came from China, and that Chinese Americans and Asian Americans somehow are more likely to be, responsible than others. So I'm working on something to try and combat that, and in real time contribute to defeating this virus and its effect on our communities. So those are some of the things I'm working on. As you can tell, I'm busier than ever in many respects. And no, I certainly never imagined we'd be in these circumstances, but I can't help but feel like my campaign was maybe a little bit before its time, but not as much before its time as a lot of people thought.
Well, there's nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come. And it really, some may think it ironic, again, that you raise the issue of a guaranteed annual income or basic income. But perhaps it's certainly, we can all say now, everyone will say now, well, this Andrew Yang came up with this idea, and because it's what our nation needs. I'm one who believes that when something is open, once it is put out in the universe and it begins to be manifest by whatever means, how tragic this is at this time, that people tragically losing their lives because of a crisis. But another door is opening so that a concept of a basic income can be heard. Whereas there were many, I think, millions around the country who heard it, but I'm not sure that the elected body itself heard it. And it's loud and clear now. And I do believe that we're going to see, some things opening up. One of the things that I want to ask is, where do you see ways that maybe we could work together? I would certainly love to have that opportunity. I mean, you are doing so many wonderful things to transform this nation and really to help save humanity. And so I just wanted to ask that.
Well, first, just let me say very transparently, of course, this is not my idea. I mean, this is more your father's idea and other people's idea than Andrew Yang's. And in terms of our working together, there are so many things we can do, because we need to build this coalition. We need to activate people's sense of possibility, really. I think that was one of my biggest learnings from the campaign, is that I would go around talking about, guaranteed income. And for most people, it's just like, that's too good to be true. Like that can't happen. And so the more people whose minds and hearts we can open, the better. And you're going to be an enormous influence on many, many people. And so I'd love to work with you to help continue to open hearts and minds to the fact that we must improve our own way of life. And I'll tell you, I mean, like, people who thought it was too good to be true, obviously, when they get this $1,200 in the next couple of weeks, they'll be like, oh, I guess we can do that. And then when we come around and make the same argument, being like, hey, we should probably do that all the time, then I think they'll be 80% of the way there, because they'll be like, wait a minute, we did that once, and I liked it, and it was positive, and it turns out we did have the ability to conjure $2.2 trillion out of thin air when circumstances required it. And so, it's possible that we can put this money into our hands regularly, and it would end up just improving our way of life. So would love to consider you a friend and champion of this vision. And you and I will find many, many ways to make it happen together. I have a vision right now. We're going to be in the room together when this thing gets signed into law.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly would welcome all of these opportunities. Let me ask you a political question on that. How do you think this will affect the current administration and leadership? It obviously will have some kind of effect, but how do you? I mean, it certainly cannot have a negative effect, and nor should it. But how do you think this affects in terms of those who are specifically political? And it's not about this side or that side. For me, it's really about who demonstrates the leadership to pull this country together so that we can resolve our issues and then be in a better position to help others around the world and the planet to address their issues.
I mean, job one, and this isn't going to be surprising to anyone, I believe we need to defeat Donald Trump in the fall, after this crisis is over. So, I mean, really, job one is helping each other get through this crisis. But then job 1A is trying to defeat Donald Trump in the fall. And I believe at this point, Donald Trump's fate will be determined by how we get through this crisis, really. At this point, it's less about what the Democrats are doing than how the American people receive Trump over these days. And then moving forward, it's interesting. And one reason I'm so grateful to talk to you, so that we have political leaders, but then we have other leaders in other walks of life in America. And I'm a big believer that there are going to be other people from fields outside of politics that end up playing a very, very big role in helping knit us back together. Because unfortunately, there are now tens of millions of Americans that don't regard politics as something that they should pay a lot of attention to. That there are many people who don't think that politicians are really working on their behalf anymore. And I think that there are very legitimate reasons why they feel that way. And so we're going to have to develop leaders from all walks of life, from different communities, combine it with political leadership, if we're going to really get into the heart of a lot of these problems that you and I want to solve.
Do you see on the horizon other young, leaders? Because it's certainly one of my points of view is that it certainly takes a combination of middle-aged, young people, older people. Older people sometimes will have some ideas, but young people have to take those ideas and implement them energetically throughout the community. And so do you see emerging leaders that are on the horizon all over the nation and the world?
Extraordinary young people, for sure. And I think that they are going to end up leading us forward in many ways. To me, a lot of the problem is that we're in a bit of a hurry right now, in my opinion. So when people look up and say, hey, like this next generation is going to get it and then they're going to lead us over a period of time, I might agree with that, but I also would suggest that would probably take years and even decades to play out. So we're going to need, like you just said, like leaders from every generation together working, because if we all wait for the next generation to mature and take over, we just don't have the time. But they're there. Like there's some extraordinary people.
Yeah. I one of the reasons I raised that question was because we have a daughter and you have children. And interestingly enough, our children do at least try to emulate some of the things that we do. And I've already seen it in our daughter. I've seen. Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm swapping the light for the battery. I've got a battery thing, but we're gonna do some
technology no problem.
Swapping. So keep talking. All right, sorry about this. Just trust I'm doing this for the good of our.
I was essentially saying that. Okay, I was essentially saying that I've seen certain qualities in our daughter, and I'm certain you've seen qualities in your children. Many of our children don't necessarily want to go in the same areas or arenas that we've gone into. I feel very blessed, and my wife and I are very fortunate that we are not pushing our daughter to do anything other than the things that she wants to do. And the fact is, fortunately, she has an interest in social justice. And so that is a wonderful thing, because she's the only grandchild of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. And so if she chose not to be, that is certainly her right. We want her to be the best Yolanda that she can be. But I think that a lot will be left up to our children. But it's interesting the things that they want to emulate that we do. So I can imagine your children have to be extraordinarily proud of you and the work that you and your wife and family are doing.
Well, thank you for that. My kids are too young and too clueless to really know what the heck Daddy's doing. They have like very low interest in anything Daddy does. But I couldn't agree with you more, though. Children have to find their own path. It certainly sounds like Yolanda certainly has a lot, a lot, like huge shoes to fill potentially if she decides to step into that. But I'm glad that she has a native interest, because we need her.
And so we need her and many more.
And many more, exactly.
Many more. Just a couple more questions that come to. Were you able to have any level of focus around voter suppression? And although right this moment that is not where anyone would be focused, but once we get past the crisis and we get toward the election, it seems to me that one of the major issues in our society is that we should never be suppressing the right to vote of anyone, and yet there are many states that still are in fact doing that, including my own state of Georgia.
Yeah, Georgia's obviously, because it's, sorry about this.
No problem.
I think I'm going to do it. Did I do it? Believe it or not, that was necessary. I had to plug the phone in because they're on this phone, and then
sure.
The light for the phone is what just happened. I met Stacy very, very briefly. I did some calls to try and activate people who'd been purged off of the rolls. I have friends who are working on various voter protection efforts, trying to combat suppression. And it's clear that it's a real problem, and it's clear that there are a lot of things that we can and should do to try and protect voter rights in Georgia and around the country. So to me, that is one of the areas that we should be, that we should be working really hard on. And I applaud Stacey for helping lead efforts, not just in Georgia, but nationally.
Yeah. Well, I know that was one of my biggest concerns about this upcoming election, that we will have states where voter suppression has been instituted. And if we don't address that, then that means more than likely that the potential leadership may not change. And of course, you know, I politically have been, I think, very forfeit that I do believe leadership starts at the top, and we must have a change if the country's going to change, because we have a divider. And I don't believe, I would like to believe and always am prayerful that something different will happen, but I don't know that capacity exists within the current administrator. And so therefore, we must have a change, but it's going to take all of us engaged, because I do believe that unfortunately so many people do not engage in a nation that we call a democratic nation. You probably know that out of the 170 or 80 democratic nations, we vote at 138. So 130 or 139, 138 nations vote at higher levels than us. So how do we address that particular issue? And I think one of the things I do believe is your candidacy did excite a lot of people, and I hope that they stay engaged and excited. I know that you certainly have a huge following of people, and we must engage them and many more if we're going to be successful, I guess.
Yeah, I was really proud of the fact that we engaged so many young voters, and I need to keep on revving up people who don't think politics is for them. And as you just said, that's unfortunately tens of millions of Americans. So it's not just me, it's a lot of people. But it's one reason why I love universal basic income or guaranteed annual income so much, is that most people look up and this stuff's not relevant to me. But if they really think that they're going to get $1,000 a month, it becomes relevant very, very quickly. And so we can make that case to them, then we can expand the electorate and get ourselves up from 139 to, you know, hopefully just into the double digits.
Well, then there's no question about that. Well, this has been a very it has been a wonderful experience for me personally, and I want to thank you and to send our prayers to you and your family and all of those across America as we are going through this crisis together. And of course, the hope is that we'll become a better nation out of this tragedy. What I've noticed is that in the times of very difficult situations, Americans have a tendency historically to come together. When we see tsunamis or when we see hurricanes or when we see tornadoes or fires, Americans, we know that there's a goodness at the core of who we are. And my experience has been when those crisis situations occur, some individuals have resources, they'll just send those resources. Some individuals don't, but they'll go right to the scene and they want to help no matter who you are. They just see you in distress and they want to help. What happens though is once the crisis is passed, we go back to our corners and end up separated. And so I don't know what it is that we need to do to create. We don't need to create crisis, but we need to create how we respond that environment, I think, during crisis. So just in that vein, I just want to thank you for sharing this time with us today. And I want you to know it means a tremendous amount to us that you would continue to use your voice and your platform to bring about change throughout our nation and our world.
Well, thank you so much. And please do consider me a friend and ally in this struggle, because I've learned a tremendous amount from you and your family. And we have so much to do together. So I'm thrilled to be able to spend this time with you. And hopefully what you're suggesting will come to pass, that we will come out of this crisis stronger and more unified.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Be
All
well,
right.
be safe. All the best to the family.
And same to you. Thank you.
Put the money in our hands. 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 Can we afford it? Yes. Will it cause inflation? No. Is it awesome? Yes. Is anyone trying to make it happen? Yeah, that guy.